Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The compound was quiet the morning Dinma arrived, too quiet for a house that held children. The air felt heavier than the clouds that threatened rain, and even at 9 years old, Dinma could sense that her presence tilted something out of place. Her small legs swung from the edge of the rickety bench where her uncle had left her, a faded nylon bag clutched to her chest. Inside it, folded with fragile care, were all the things her mother once touched. Her auntie stood at the doorway, arms folded, brows high, her voice slicing through the silence like it didn't belong to a woman but a blade. "So it's this one they brought?" she said to no one in particular, her tone already wrapped in resentment. Behind her, the shriek of a pestle pounding into a mortar echoed through the corridor like a warning. That was Dinma's first welcome to the home she hadn't chosen. From the start, the house functioned like a machine, and Dinma was not a gear, but an intruder between its workings. Her auntie, known by most in the village as Mama Linda, had two daughters of her own, Linda and Deborah, each firmly held in the warmth and privileges Dinma would never taste. While they wore matching uniforms each morning and their laughter spilled down the dusty road as they ran to catch the school bus, Dinma swept, fetched water, and washed their socks. Nobody told her what her role was. It was simply made clear. If she didn't scrub the pot well enough, the wooden spoon found her back. If she left the gate slightly ajar, she was accused of inviting thieves. Food was served in measures, and Dinma quickly learned that her portion came last, and only if Mama Linda was in a tolerable mood. Nights were spent on a woven mat in the passageway, where the floor never stopped creaking, and the lizards on the ceiling blinked down at her like quiet judges. Weeks turned into months, and Dinma, too afraid to ask questions, learned to move like shadow, present but unacknowledged. She would wake before anyone else, scrub the veranda, heat water for her auntie's morning bath, and then disappear into corners where her presence wouldn't offend. Her only conversations were with objects, the sound of a spoon clinking against the pot, the rhythmic slap of laundry against the stone, the whisper of her own breath. But sometimes, in the narrow hour between finishing chores and darkness falling, she would watch the neighbors' children play and imagine a world where her mother still brushed her hair and her father still lifted her into the air. In this house, she learned the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from fear. Yet even in that silence, something inside her refused to die. Something small, something stubborn. The days blended into each other, each one folding into the next like the faded wrapper's Dinma hand, washed and spread on the clothesline. There were no surprises in her routine, only the strict rhythm of obedience. But beneath that daily repetition, something began to shift, not in the house, but in her. She had started noticing shoes. Not just the way they scuffed across the compound or dragged along the market road, but the designs, the way the leather curved, the stitching patterns, the slight heels, and the colors that told stories of their wearers. Dinma would squat in the dust behind her auntie's canteen after the day's work, collecting torn sandals and old slippers others tossed aside. Her fingers moved with patience as she peeled apart their seams and tried to understand how they were made. No one had taught her. She had never even owned a pair worth more than 100 naira. But something in her spirit responded to the craft as though creation, quiet, hidden creation, was the one thing still hers. One afternoon, while picking beans inside the small shed where her auntie stored firewood, she found an old thread spool and some bent nails. They weren't tools, but they became hers. She used a rusted razor blade to slice off rubber soles from discarded slippers, sewing them clumsily to patched fabric pieces she shaped into something that almost resembled a shoe. It was far from perfect, but she cradled it like it was gold. Her hands blistered and cracked, but she never stopped. She worked only when no one could see her, mostly late at night or on quiet afternoons when Linda and Deborah were out. Once, she tried to show her creation to her auntie, hoping for even the smallest flicker of encouragement, but the response was a burst of scorn so fierce it made her stomach twist. Her auntie's voice, laced with disgust, echoed in her ears for days. "So you now want to become a shoemaker? A girl that doesn't know how to boil rice properly wants to be useful?" After that, Denma stopped seeking validation. Instead, she buried her efforts under the floorboard in her corner of the house, like a secret garden that bloomed only in darkness. But dreams, no matter how quietly they begin, start to breathe louder with time. Denma's body was thin, but her thoughts were no longer small. She began saving money, tiny coins hidden inside the seams of her wrapper or under her sleeping mat, hoping one day to buy a real sewing awl or a piece of leather from the market. Her ears tuned to conversations in the canteen, how shoes were priced, how much women paid for comfort, what styles sold fast. Nobody noticed how carefully she listened. And when the firewood finished one Saturday, she volunteered to go fetch more, just so she could walk past the shoemaker's stall near the roadside and pause for a second too long, pretending to tie her wrapper as she studied his hands. That night, she stitched her best pair yet, uneven but sturdy, a mix of faded brown fabric and a rubber sole. She wore it in the dark, pacing slowly, trying not to smile. It was the first time in a long while that something touched her spirit and didn't immediately disappear. The harmattan wind had just begun to stretch its fingers across the village, coating every rooftop and tree with a film of dust so fine it made the air taste dry. Denma was behind the canteen that afternoon, peeling yam with calloused fingers when she heard someone call her name, a voice from another part of her life. Chica stood near the wooden fence, her smile wide and familiar, her wrapper tied in the hurried way that suggested she had come a long distance. Denma dropped the knife and wiped her hands on the edge of her wrapper before running to embrace her friend. Chica had once lived in the same compound before her parents moved to the next village. Though they hadn't spoken in months, the hug melted the silence between them. They sat under the mango tree where the branches swayed just enough to offer shade from the dull sun. As they caught up, Chica's voice lowered into a whisper, her tone shifting from playful to serious. "Some people are coming," she said, eyes darting. "From the King's family. Investors. They want to help people with skills, those who have handwork." Denma listened, still. Then, like a tiny flame catching firewood, something flared behind her eyes. She didn't speak immediately. Her heart was beating faster than her thoughts could catch. Chica reached for her hand, her voice gentle now. "You fit try, Denma. Just make sure say you no stop." The weight of those words sat deep in Denma's chest. Chica didn't know how hard it was for her to find even minutes of freedom, how the house she lived in swallowed time with endless chores. But instead of explaining, Denma nodded slowly, her throat tight with emotion. As they said goodbye, Chica pressed a small notebook into Denma's palm. "For your sketches," she said with a wink. "I get another one." That night, long after the dishes were done and the canteen closed, Denma lay on her mat under the flickering lantern light, tracing shapes in the notebook with a charcoal stub. She drew straps, soles, designs from memory. The paper was rough, and her hands trembled, but the act itself felt sacred, like she was finally planting something that belonged to her in soil that had always tried to reject her. In the days that followed, Denma's steps became different. Her chores didn't change, but something about her pace, about the way she watched people's shoes again, about how she paused longer in front of certain fabric stalls in the market, felt alive. When Mama Linda shouted or complained about money or about how Linda was refusing to return to school, Denma kept her head down, listening only to the sound of her own hopes rising. Linda, who now spent most of her days lounging on the couch and pretending to be too sick to cook, grew more irritable. And when money went missing from the canteen drawer, the accusations, like always, landed squarely on Denma's shoulders. "You think say because you dey follow market girls walking now, "You fit day thief," her auntie barked one evening. Dinmah didn't defend herself anymore. Words were wasted in that house. But late that night, she slipped out of bed, quietly pulled out her notebook, and kept sketching shapes, straps, laces, and dreams. The air was cold, her fingers numb, but her vision was clear. The thought of someone believing in her, of strangers giving her a chance, was enough to keep her hands moving. The sun was merciless that day, hanging like a burning eye over the rust-colored rooftops. Dinmah walked along the narrow village path, with a basin balanced on her head, its weight digging into her skull through the thin layer of wrapper she had folded as cushion. The road shimmered ahead of her, the heat rising in thick, wavering sheets, and each step felt heavier than the last. Her feet, dust-stained and aching, moved over stones and dried leaves. Traders had begun closing their stalls, and children ran barefoot across the road, chasing each other with squeals that faded into the background hum of village life. Dinmah said nothing to anyone as she passed. She kept her eyes low, partly from habit, partly to hide the exhaustion stretched across her face. She didn't hear the car at first. The sound of tires crunching gravel was too soft, too unfamiliar, until the vehicle slowed beside her and stopped. She glanced up, startled, just as the glass rolled down. A man in a clean white shirt leaned toward her. "You look tired. Can I give you a lift?" For a moment, Dinmah just stared. It wasn't just that cars rarely stopped for girls like her. It was the kind of car, sleek and shining like it didn't belong on this dusty road. The man behind the wheel had a calm, warm face, and his eyes held none of the usual judgment she was used to. She hesitated, then shifted the basin off her head and clutched it in her arms, her voice low. "I'm going to Nawari Junction." The man nodded. "Hop in. I'm heading that way." Inside the car, the air smelled of something expensive and clean. She sat with her shoulders tense, her back barely touching the seat. The silence between them grew, thick and uncertain, until he broke it gently. "What's your name?" She turned slightly, unsure if she should answer, but something about his voice made it feel safe. "Dinmah," she said. "And you?" He smiled without arrogance. "Obiora." The name didn't ring any bells until he mentioned the palace. "My father is the king. I help manage his estate when I'm not being forced to attend long meetings." His tone was playful, but Dinmah could only nod, unsure how to respond to someone who seemed to live in a world so different from hers. The car ride was brief, but something shifted in that short stretch of road. Obiora didn't ask invasive questions or look at her with pity. Instead, he told her about how he hated wearing heavy agbatas, and how he once burned rice trying to impress someone. Dinmah laughed softly for the first time in weeks. It felt foreign in her mouth, but free. When they arrived at the junction, he pulled over gently. "Take care, Dinmah. Maybe I'll see you again." She stepped out slowly, murmuring a thank you, the weight of the basin oddly comforting now. As the car drove away, she stood there a little longer than necessary, watching the dust swirl in its wake. Something inside her stirred, not love, not yet, but a realization that the world might not be as closed off as she thought, that even in a place where she had been made small, someone had looked at her and simply seen a person. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to make the sky seem less heavy that evening. The morning air was sharp, heavy with the scent of fried beans and kerosene smoke as Dinmah knelt beside the grinding stone behind the canteen, her hands moving without thought. Her fingers ached from the cold, but her mind was elsewhere. The competition date was approaching fast, just 2 days left. Each night, she had stitched and restitched the same pair of shoes, determined to make them perfect. They were the best she had ever made, dark brown faux leather stitched over sturdy soles, the inner lining soft, the buckle handmade. She had wrapped them in a nylon bag and hidden them in a crevice behind the firewood stack. It was a risk, but the shoes were all she had. That morning, she planned to slip out after washing the dishes and make her way to the village hall to submit her entry. Her auntie had traveled briefly the day before to settle a quarrel with a food supplier, so the timing felt perfect. She whispered a small prayer as she scrubbed the soot off a burnt pot, her stomach tied in quiet knots. But the plan crumbled just before noon. As she was rinsing plates at the back tap, her auntie's voice sliced through the yard, sharp and unexpected. "Dinma, so now this house you want to disgrace." Dinma froze, soap suds dripping from her hands. Mama Linda had returned earlier than expected and stood by the kitchen door holding the nylon bag. Her shoes peeked out from the torn edge of the plastic like silent witnesses. Dinma's heart thudded. "You want to sneak out and embarrass me in front of this village? A girl like you, entering competition with people whose mothers gave birth to them with pride?" The slap landed before Dinma could speak, sending her stumbling into the basin. Water splashed across the concrete, but she didn't cry. Her cheeks stung, but her pride, her quiet, hidden pride, burned hotter. Mama Linda paced in front of her like a storm, looking for more things to destroy. "You will not go anywhere," she hissed. "You will tell them to remove your name. Do you hear me?" Dinma didn't answer. Not because she was being stubborn, but because something had shifted inside her. She realized no amount of obedience would ever win her place in this house. So when her auntie barked again, demanding a response, Dinma lifted her head slowly and said, "I won't withdraw." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Her auntie's eyes widened, not with rage, but shock. Dinma had always bent, always nodded, always faded into the walls of that compound. But now she was standing taller, her eyes unblinking, her voice steady. For a long second, Mama Linda didn't move. Then, like a match struck on stone, her fury reignited. She grabbed Dinma by the wrapper and dragged her toward the kitchen, pushing her against the wooden shelf. "You think because you wear my slippers and eat my food, you can now talk back?" Dinma said nothing. Her breaths came in small, controlled bursts, her hands clenched at her sides. When her auntie finally released her, she spat on the floor and stormed inside. That night, Dinma ate nothing. She didn't touch her mat. She sat in the corridor with her back against the wall and her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Her body was sore, her heart pounding, but there was something unshakable rising in her now, a quiet refusal to be erased. The morning sun crept through the narrow spaces in the window, casting dull strips of light across the floor where Dinma slept. She woke with a jolt, her ears straining for the usual bustle of movement outside, but the compound was unusually quiet. A strange stillness sat in the air like an omen. She stood and reached for her wrapper, already thinking of how to slip away to the village hall before the crowd gathered. Her shoes were hidden in her water basin, wrapped tightly in a black cloth, ready. But when she turned the doorknob to the passage, it didn't budge. Confused, she turned it again, harder this time. Nothing. She tried the back door. Locked. Panic prickled beneath her skin. Her auntie had locked her in. The realization hit like cold water. She ran to the window, pulling aside the faded curtain, but the compound was empty. Even the neighbors seemed to have vanished into the silence of morning routines. Her hands trembled as she tried the door again, over and over, the sound of the bolt rattling, echoing in her chest like laughter. Hours passed. The day outside moved on without her, as if the world had forgotten she existed. She sat by the window, eyes fixed on the mango tree in the distance where children usually gathered, but even that felt like a dream now. She thought of the village hall, of people submitting their work, of the noise, the excitement, the faces full of hope. Her mouth was dry, her throat sore from yelling earlier when she first discovered she was trapped. But no one had come. Linda must have been the one to turn the key. That lazy smirk she wore whenever Dinma got blamed replayed in Dinma's mind like a wound being picked open. Dinma curled into herself, her back against the wall, her hands clutching the bundle of shoes she could never submit. The hours stretched, long and cruel. The sun shifted until its light no longer reached her window. The competition would end by 4 p.m. By the time she heard the distant sound of evening voices, it was over. When the door finally creaked open at dusk, Mama Linda walked in, her face lined with travel fatigue. Dust clung to the hem of her wrapper, and her brows were furrowed, not in anger this time, but confusion. She had gone to Ebra's school to find her, only to be met with shame. Her second daughter was pregnant and hiding in a boys' off-campus room. She returned home with disappointment clinging to her like sweat, expecting to find dinner ready and the house calm. Instead, she found Denma sitting in the hallway with swollen eyes, holding a cloth bundle like it contained life itself. Their eyes met. Mama Linda opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came. She walked past without a word. Denma remained on the cold cement floor, still and quiet, but her silence no longer came from fear. It came from something harder, something finished. The kind of silence that grows when dreams are crushed while still warm. The next morning broke with a restless sky, thick clouds rolling low, as if the heavens themselves bore a weight too heavy to carry. Mama Linda moved around the house with slow, distracted steps. The trip to the university had unsettled something in her. Ebra, her pride, her golden child, had refused to return home, her belly swollen and her excuses flimsy. The boy responsible wasn't just young. He was careless, without plans or promise. Mama Linda had returned to the village with no daughter beside her and no answers to offer the neighbors, who now gossiped with renewed vigor. Each time she looked at Denma, something uncomfortable stirred in her. The girl hadn't spoken since yesterday, hadn't wept or shouted. She simply went about her chores with a stillness that unnerved. That morning, as Mama Linda stirred agbono soup over the fire, she overheard two women chatting near the front of the compound. They say one girl's work was so good, the committee gave her another chance to submit. Her name is Denma. The spoon fell from Mama Linda's hand and clattered against the iron pot. She stepped outside, her wrapper clinging to her skin, heart pounding in a way she didn't understand. At first, she thought it was a lie, a village rumor twisted to mock her. But by mid-morning, the news had spread like wild harmattan fire. Obiora, the king's first son, had seen the girl's work and insisted on a review. It was said that her shoes were different, detailed, original. He had arranged for her to be called back, given a second chance. Mama Linda's hands trembled as she sat on the stool beneath the pawpaw tree, her mind spinning in disbelief. How could this same girl, this girl she had mocked, starved, beaten, stand now as the name on everyone's lips? The other women began to ask questions, but Mama Linda offered no answers. Her face tightened into a mask of shame. She sent Linda to call Denma inside, but when the girl entered, head high, there was no triumph in her expression, just quiet resolve. That afternoon, Denma walked through the village square alone, the grant certificate clutched tightly in her palm. It wasn't the money that made her chest rise with pride. It was the moment itself. She had been seen, not pitied, not dismissed. Seen for what she had built with her hands, for the skill she had taught herself in silence. As she approached the small building, where her name now hung with 4 others on a public list, people turned to look. Some nodded with respect, others whispered with awe. Obiora was there, standing at the far end in his simple shirt, no royal airs about him. Their eyes met across the open yard. He walked to her slowly and said with a half-smile, "You made it." Denma nodded, unsure what to say, her heart thudding louder than the crowd's noise. For the first time, the air around her felt light. Not because the village had changed, but because she had. And she wasn't asking for space anymore, she was taking it. Rain fell in soft sheets the morning Denma collected her grant, It wasn't the heavy, violent kind that flooded roads, but a gentle drizzle that whispered over rooftops and made the air smell like wet soil and rebirth. She arrived at the village hall early, dressed in a plain gown that clung damply to her skin. Her shoes, the very pair that had changed everything, were wrapped in nylon, held close to her chest like a shield. Inside, the hall was quiet save for the rustle of papers and the low murmur of the selection team. Her name was called last. The voice that pronounced it did so without hesitation, as though it belonged there. She stepped forward slowly, her breath shallow, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of finally being seen. A check was handed to her, Dajirianai Tulliver, 5 million. Neat, official, real. The room didn't erupt in cheers, and no music played, but Dinma felt something inside her shift forever. By the end of that week, she had rented a small kiosk near the market square. It wasn't much, just a wooden structure with a leaking roof and a crooked table, but it was hers. She cleaned it herself, patching the leaks, sweeping out the dust, and hanging her sketches on the walls like decorations in a palace. The money had not changed her, but it had given her permission to dream in the open. She ordered materials from a supplier in the next town, carefully choosing good leather, tools, and lining fabric. With the help of an elderly cobbler she met during one of her quiet morning walks, she learned how to reinforce stitching, shape soles more professionally, and use polishing oil that gave her work a fine, smooth finish. People began to stop by, not just to look, but to order. At first, a few school teachers, then traders, then a woman from the local council office. Each pair she made carried a piece of her in it. The straps, the threading, even the smell of the glue. Everything told a story of where she'd come from and how far she was willing to go. Obiora returned often, sometimes without reason. He would lean against the doorframe of her kiosk, watching her work, asking questions she wasn't used to answering. Not about her past, but about her vision. He wanted to know where she saw herself in 5 years, what kind of shoes she liked to wear, whether she had ever thought of training others. His presence didn't suffocate her. It didn't crowd her thoughts. It added color to them like dye in plain water. He never made grand gestures, just stayed present, consistent. One warm evening, he showed up with a folded sheet of paper. Just a formality, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. It was a letter, a formal proposal. His family knew. His intentions were clear. He wanted to marry her. Dinma read it in silence, the corners of her mouth tugging into a soft smile. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply looked up and whispered, "Yes." It was not a fairy tale. It was something better. Something earned. Something real. The wedding was small, quiet, and deeply personal. No palace parade or public fanfare. Dinma had chosen it that way, not out of modesty, but from a desire to protect what had grown between her and Obiora, something tender, something strong. The ceremony was held under the broad shade of a large udala tree in the Obi's family compound. Only a few relatives, close friends, and community elders were invited. Dinma wore a simple coral-colored wrapper with delicate embroidery along its hem. Her head was wrapped in a jelly that Chica had tied with shaky hands and teary eyes. When she walked forward, her feet moving slowly across a path sprinkled with rose petals, Obiora's gaze didn't waver. He stood waiting, not with pomp, but with the quiet stillness of a man who knew the worth of the woman he was marrying. The guests whispered behind handheld fans, their words soft with wonder. No one could have imagined the girl who once hawked food in tattered slippers would now stand here, adorned with grace and certainty. Life after marriage did not transform Dinma into someone new. It allowed her to fully become who she had always been. The palace quarters she moved into were elegant, but not overwhelming. Obiora ensured she had a workroom within the compound, a space with large windows, a wide table, and walls where she could pen her designs freely. She spent mornings shaping shoes and afternoons teaching two young girls she had recently employed, both of whom had dropped out of school. She paid them weekly, fed them lunch, and taught with patience, never raising her voice. Each stitch was a lesson, each mistake a moment for growth. Obiora watched quietly, often sitting beside her after sunset while she trimmed leather or organized her tools. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. But their silences were full, not the hollow kind she had once known, but the peaceful quiet of being seen and accepted without condition. Back in her old neighborhood, however, things were different. Mama Linda walked with a slower gait now, her shoulders not as high, her voice quieter in gatherings. Linda had stopped speaking of the university entirely and spent her days indoors, often avoiding the eyes of those who used to admire her. The house, once loud with activity and superiority, now echoed with stillness. Neighbors who once sided with Mama Linda now crossed the street when she approached, their greetings polite but distant. Rumors had done their damage, but none of it mattered as much as the silence that stretched between mother and daughter at home. There was no confrontation, no collapse, just an emptiness that sat between them like old dust. Dinma did not return to gloat or explain herself. She stayed where she belonged now, but deep inside her, she knew that healing, real healing, sometimes needed absence, not apologies. And in that absence, she finally began to breathe freely. It was on a soft, windless afternoon that Dinma returned to the compound where her pain had once lived. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that doesn't promise rain, but still casts a cool, heavy shadow. She arrived unannounced, dressed in a plain blue wrapper and a white blouse that fluttered lightly in the breeze. No entourage, no flashy car, just a quiet presence. Her driver parked discreetly at the junction while she walked the familiar road on foot, her steps slow but firm. The rusted gate creaked as she pushed it open, and for a moment the sound alone felt like a memory. The compound looked smaller now. The veranda where she had once scrubbed until her knees bled was cracked. The walls had lost their color. She stood there for a while, staring, not with anger, but with stillness. Inside, the scent of Audrey and stale kerosene drifted into her nose, and she realized how little had changed. And yet everything had. Mama Linda emerged from the kitchen slowly, a worn wrapper tied loosely around her chest, her eyes narrowing at first to make out who was standing at the door. When recognition hit her, she froze. The wooden spoon in her hand dropped to the floor with a dull thud. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence thickened. Then, with trembling lips, Mama Linda whispered, "Dinma, you came." Her voice cracked beneath the weight of shame. Dinma didn't move. She looked into the eyes of the woman who had once made her doubt her worth, who had taken a broken little girl and buried her deeper in sorrow. But that same girl had climbed out, inch by inch, with blistered hands and a heart that refused to die. Mama Linda fell to her knees, her hands stretched forward like branches aching for forgiveness. "I was wrong," she said. "I didn't know what I was doing. I thought—" Her words failed her, collapsing under the truth she had tried to ignore for years. "Forgive me," she pleaded. Dinma watched her quietly, not coldly, not cruelly, just with a calm that came from finally having nothing to prove. She bent slightly, picked up the fallen spoon, and placed it gently on the wooden stool beside the door. "You are not God," she said softly. "You don't decide how far someone can go." Her voice wasn't bitter, it was even, steady. Mama Linda wept openly now, her sobs heavy with years of guilt and pride unraveling at once. Dinma didn't reach for her. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back toward the gate, the air around her warm with quiet freedom. As she stepped into the street, the wind stirred faintly, lifting the hem of her wrapper and brushing past her skin like a blessing. She didn't look back. Her heart was light, her path open. And for the first time in her life, she knew, truly knew, that she had become everything they said she never could. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.